So, what was your introduction to motorsports? How were you first introduced to that?
I think the very first time was probably 1955 when I went to Aintree in the north of England in Lancashire, not very far from where I lived,
Mhm.
and to watch the British Grand Prix, which was won by Stirling Moss in a Mercedes, closely followed by Juan Manuel Fangio, the world champion, in second place. I think actually that he let Stirling win because it was the British Grand Prix. I actually asked Sterling about that at Amelia Island about 5 years ago. And I said, you know, Sterling, do you think Fangio let you win the British Grand Prix in 1955? And he said, do you know, old boy, I've often wondered about that. So that was the first race I saw. And then I went to one or two more, but it wasn't the atmosphere or the sounds or anything else that really got me going. It was the fact that I wasn't very good at school. And when I was 16, I was at a boys' boarding school in the north of England. And the headmaster called me into his study and he said, Redman, I suggest you leave school. We can't teach you anything. So I left at 16. So I took over a business in 1957 that my grandfather on my mother's side had been running, and he passed away. And he was a great car enthusiast. In fact, you know, when he died age 73, he had a MGA coupe. And so he was extremely good and extremely keen. But anyway, I took over the business, and it was mop heads, which you make, you know, those floppy things that you clean the floors.
Yeah.
I had a Morris 1000 Woody, and I delivered mop heads in it all around the north of England. And I drove like a maniac, you know, and I put a supercharger on it and harder brake linings, da da da. And I thought I'd better get off the road before I kill somebody else or myself. So that's how I started. And so for 5 or 6 years, that's all I did. These were one-day race meetings. You couldn't do it today, but you just drove to the racetrack. You took shoe whitener out and painted a number on the door and put electrical tape over the headlights. That was it. No roll bar, no fire extinguisher, and no safety belts. So that carried on 1960 with a Mini Minor 848cc, 1961 a Jaguar XK120, 62 a Morgan Plus 4. And then in 65, a gentleman asked if I'd like to drive his Jaguar lightweight E-Type. This was really a special car that had been driven by the famous British world champion, Graham Hill. And we had a fantastic year in the car. In 15 races, we were only beaten once, and that was by a Ferrari 250 LM, which is
Yeah.
basically a bit faster car. And then in 67, the brother of this gentleman, Mr. Bridges, he said, do you want to turn professional? And I said, you know, what does that mean? He said, it means I'll pay you 30 quid a week. That was about $50 a week, guaranteed for a year with a car and a mechanic. And so that's how I turned professional. And towards the end of that year, I'd been driving a Ferrari in a long distance race at the Paris 1,000 kilometers. And it was very wet. It was terrible. And we did okay. And after the race, a gentleman came up to me, introduced himself as David York, the team manager for John Wire Automotive Engineering. And he asked if I'd like to drive in the Kyalami 9-hour race in about 4 weeks' time in November 1967 with the Belgian wonder boy, Jackie X. And Jackie and I won the race, and I signed a contract then for 68. So that's how it all started.
So that's pretty interesting. Yeah, that's a kind of snowball basically from starting early days to that kind of thing. Was there any kind of did you ever have kind of right way to phrase this? I know you did endurance racing, you did Formula One, you did a lot of sports car racing. Was there ever a favorite of yours that you preferred over one another?
Well, I suppose in the sports cars, first of all, the 1968 car, the GT40 Ford Mark I with John Wire Automotive Engineering, that was a great car. And you felt safe in it. It was a very strong monocoque. But then it kind of got outlawed. It was getting old because it had come out in basically about 1963. Now we're at 1968. So it was definitely long in the tooth in terms of racing, although it was still winning races. But the rules for racing had changed because the Americans had come to Le Mans 24-hour race with their giant 7-liter engines in the Fords, the Mark II and the Mark IV. And they'd won Le Mans twice, in 66 and 67. And then they actually won in 69, 68 and 9. 68, I should have been driving with Jackie Ickx in our favorite GT40, number 1075. And first of all, I had a really bad accident in Belgium in the Formula One car. It was my third Formula One race. I finished third in the second race at the Spanish Grand Prix. And this was my third race at Spa-Francorchamps in Belgium, where Ickx and I had won the 1,000-kilometer race in the GT40. And about the 7th lap, my suspension broke. And I had an enormous accident. I rolled over one of the few barriers because it was mostly trees. My disarm was trapped between the car and the barrier. And I went right into a marshal's point, and I hit a parked car like this. And 3 wheels came off the car and it caught fire. And when they eventually got me on the operating table that night at the University of Liège Teaching Hospital, Professor Orban, who'd been a Winston Churchill aide in World War II, says to me, "Monsieur Redman, it may not be possible to save your arm." And I smiled. I said, "Thank you, Professor." He says, "Why are you smiling?" I said, "Because I'm here." So as may imagined, I then spent several months, 5 or 6 months, without driving, and then went to South Africa in November, back to the South African series with a Chevron 2-liter. And I just signed a contract with Porsche for 1969 because of this change in the rules. Effectively, the Fédération Internationale Automobile, FIA, which is still the governing body of motorsport worldwide, they had banned the Fords effectively from Le Mans. And you then could only have 3-liter maximum engine size for a prototype. But if you built 50 cars, you could have 5-liter. So what happened was Porsche, who at this time realized for the first time ever, they had a chance of winning the manufacturer's championship because of the change in the rules. And so I'd signed with them. My arm hadn't healed. I'd have it redone in Johannesburg anyway. So fortunately, the 5 Porsche 908s running at Daytona, 24 hours, they all broke down. And because my arm was still in pretty bad shape, really, I was driving with one arm like this and resting my bad arm on the wheel in case something happened and I had to make a sudden move. And about 8 in the evening, the first of the 908 longtails came in the pits. The engine was misfiring. And the engineers examined it. "We are finished. They will all break." And we were out by midnight. So that saved my arm, really. And then Sebring, they all broke their chassis. So at this point, Porsche aren't having a very good time. But after Sebring, then everything was perfect and the cars were very reliable. And my great co-driver, Joe Siffert, the Swiss driver of Porsche, we won 5 of the 10 races in 1969. So effectively winning the championship for Porsche for the first time. So yeah. So.
Speaking of co-drivers, do you ever have, would you say you have a favorite co-driver that you got along with the best, or?
I really, I was very lucky that in my career in the sports cars, I had the best co-drivers in the world, really. Jackie Ickx, the young Belgian, he was probably 8 years younger than me, but he was the best in the world at that time. So he was great. And Joe Siffert, as mentioned, I drove with him for 2 years. And both years Porsche won the championship, and he and I won 8 races out of 20. So he was terrific. And then later with Ferrari, phone's ringing. I'll try and turn the sound off. Hold on. Ah, won't turn off. So I raced with again with Jackie Ickx. So now we're driving for Ferrari instead of Ford in 72 and 73. And the team was very, very strong. They were mostly Formula One drivers in 72. Carlos Reutemann, Mario Andretti, Clay Regazzoni, Ronnie Peterson, Jackie Ickes, and so on and so forth. So we had a great team. My phone's ringing. I can't stop it. So yes, so I was very lucky in that respect. I always had great co-drivers.
That's pretty incredible. And then one thing is, I only got into motor
Can't
racing
hear you. Can you hear me?
10 years ago. Yeah, I can hear
Sounds
you.
good.
Oh, hello?
Sounds good.
Can you hear me?
Hello?
Hello? I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Share screen, record, apps, mute. No. Huh. It shows my microphone's on. Oh, you can hear me.
On it.
Okay, let's come back on again.
Can you hear me?
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
Yeah, it's working.
It's working now?
But except I can't
I'm
hear
not
you.
sure I understand.
You can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I listen once I hear the wait word.
That's technology.
That was Alexa trying to join in the conversation.
Yeah.
So favorite cars in the long distance cars, of course, you know, it's hard to compare. Let's say the GT40 is a pretty heavy car, about 2,200 pounds, with a 5-litre engine giving about 450 horsepower, to a Ferrari only 4 years later. The 312 PB was based on a Formula One car. So it was the Formula One engine, gearbox, wheels, brakes, everything, except it had a body on. And so that was a fantastic, so each in their era were fantastic. The Porsche in 1970, they produced a new 908. There were 3 908s, the long tail, the long sloping body, that was the LH, Langheck in German. And then there was the Kurz, the K, which was the short tail, which was an open spider. And then for 1970, they built a new 908, known as the 908-3, and it was built only for 2 races, the Nürburgring in Germany, with 175 corners per lap, 14.5 miles, and like up and down like this. And the Targa Florio in Sicily, which was 44 miles to one circuit, with 750 corners per circuit. And we won both of them. So it worked, but the work that Porsche put in at that time was unbelievable. It was all due to Dr. Piëch, Ferdinand Piëch, who was a nephew of the original Dr. Porsche. And he was a very dynamic person. And he spent money like there was no, he nearly bankrupted Porsche at that time.
You got the win, so that's what's important,
Yes,
right?
yes.
And then just thinking about these tracks, like 44 miles, I think you said you crashed at Targa Florio, correct?
That's
And you were,
yeah, a year later. What happened there was I'd made a stupid retirement to South Africa at the end of 1970. So I'd left John Wyer Gulf Porsche, the factory Porsche team, and I'd come back after only 4 months. I didn't understand the apartheid situation until I was living there, and I didn't have a drive. But in April, John Wyer's team manager, the same man, David York, called me and they said, would you like to do the Targa Florio? Because Joseph and I had won it the year before. And the driver who took my place in the team, Derek Bell, he'd never done it at all. And so off I go. And I think this is really a great opportunity, you know, to get back into the big time. Well, the day before the race, Suffolk crashed the race car pretty hard. And the crew worked on it all night and repaired it. Oh, back to meeting. Still there? Yeah. And
here.
very unusually, John Wyer said to me, Redman, we'd like you to start the race, because the other teammates in the other car were Pedro Rodriguez, the Mexican, and Leo Kinnunen, the Finnish driver. And normally Joseph had started. So when John Wyer asked me if I'd start, I said, why? He said, I don't want Rodriguez and Siffer knocking each other off, because they're always, these are very lightweight cars, you know, it's not a good idea to hit things with them. So I started, and right from the start of the race, the handling wasn't normal. There was something funny about it, steering. And I got 22 miles round the 44-mile track circuit, and the steering broke. And just before the race, the German engineer said to me, "Herr Redman, if you must have the accident, do not crash on the right side." Well, the right side is where the driver sat, and it's where the main fuel tank was. And of course, I had no control, so I hit a stone kilometer post right in the fuel tank, and it just exploded. And I, shut my eyes, held my breath, hit the belt release, and jumped. And I was very, very lucky. I was on fire from head to foot. My overalls were soaked in fuel, and there was no attention, no medical attention for 45 minutes, because this place is in the middle of the country. There's nobody there. And eventually I was taken to some kind of care place. It wasn't a proper hospital. Nobody knew where I was. And about 10 that night, this is like 10 or 12 hours after the accident, I'm bandaged from head to foot. My hands are bandaged, everything's bandaged. And I kept hearing them coming into the little room where I was saying, ultravioletti contra infectione. And I'm saying, bugger off. I didn't want them to touch me. But anyway, two of my driver friends came and found me. Nobody knew where I was. Richard Atwood and Pedro Rodriguez came and found me. And they took me back to the Porsche Hotel, where there was a German doctor with the team who'd come as a spectator, really. And he gave pain-killing stuff. And then the next day, Porsche and Gulf rented a jet out of Geneva, which came into Sicily, to Palermo, and I was flown out to England, to Manchester. So it was a big drama.
That's crazy. Was there ever any fear when you're behind the wheel of these cars? Did the thought of crashing ever enter your mind? Because
yes, I mean, because the cars were really fragile at that time, there was no thought about driver safety. Now look today, you see these enormous accidents in Formula One, in NASCAR, and the safety systems are just unbelievable. The driver is in a cell, really being protected. Everything flies off. So, I mean, there's hardly been a single death in Formula One for 20 odd years.
yeah,
There was one driver, a Belgian driver, a couple of years ago. He was called Bianchi.
yeah.
He went off he aquaplaned off the wet track, and he hit a crane that was picking another car off, out of, so it was crazy.
Mhm.
So I actually drove with his uncle, Lucien Bianchi. But it was, but the death and the accidents were terrible at that time. It was. And so when you were in a very fast racetrack, like let's say Le Mans or Spa-Francorchamps, particularly in a 917 Porsche, which has an aluminum tube frame, the whole frame, the whole chassis of the car only weighed 80 pounds. And if you hit something hard enough, they broke in half across the cockpit. And so, yes, I actually had tire failure and practiced in 1970 at that track. At 180 miles an hour, the left rear tire came off the rim, because in those days they didn't have any safety things at all. And the centrifugal force pulled the tire off the rim.
Mhm.
And how I didn't hit anything, I'll never know. And the next day, Sifford and I won the race. And it was the fastest long distance race ever run on a road racetrack at an average, including the pit stops, of 149. It's over 149. And the average for the fastest single lap was 160. So we're averaging 160. And there's a first gear corner, but all the other corners, there's one third gear corner, but all the whole way around the 8-mile track was top gear, going 200 miles an hour. So yes, the night before the race, you're in a car that isn't safe if you hit something, and you're going over 200 miles an hour. Yes, I did. I worried about it, but of course, when you get in the car for the race, it all goes away.
Yeah, your instinct comes in, you start driving.
Yes, you're concentrating, so hard that, yeah.
And then you raced in Formula 5000
Yes,
in the 70s, and you had 3 wins in a row, correct?
3 championships in a row.
3 championships in a row. And so what would you credit to that success?
The team really, it was Chaparral, Jim Hall, perhaps the most innovative American racing car engineer from Midland, Texas. What happened was, after I mentioned I'd come back in 71 into European racing, and things were looking pretty bad because I'd had that fire that we talked about in May. And I started racing again in July or something like that. And Sid Taylor, he put me in a Formula 5000 car. So that's a 5-litre engine in the back of various manufacturers made the cars. Lola in England, Chevron, Dan Gurney with the Eagle, all sorts of people made the cars. But at the rest race of the year at Riverside, California, I was slipstreaming the very good American driver, Sam Posey, who was driving a Surtees that was built by the ex-world champion, John Surtees. And it's the last lap, and we're flat out at about 170. And we're coming into the long, fast turn 9, and I'm right behind. I'm closing like this in the slipstream. And I'm wondering, I'm looking, is he going to go to the right or is he going to go to the left? And if he'd gone to the right, I would have gone to the left and gone around the outside. But suddenly the back of his car came at me like this. I swerved to miss him. So now I win the race. There's a protest put in. I'd overtaken under the yellow flag. So there'd been an incident or an accident, and the yellow flag means no overtaking. So the chief steward comes to me, and I was born in Burnley, Lancashire, in the north of England. And he says, I didn't know him, never seen him before in my life. He said, now then, Brian, lad, he said, I'm Joe Smith from Accrington. Accrington was 7 miles from where I lived in Burnley.
Oh, wow, yeah.
The county is called Lancashire. And he said, as one Lancashire lad to another, did you see yellow flag or not? I said, no, I didn't. He said, right, lad, you're the winner. I got fined $100. So this gentleman came up to me after the race and he introduced himself as Carl Haas, H-A-A-S. And he said, I'm the Lola race car importer for North America and the Hewland gearbox. And he said, I'm forming a partnership with Jim Hall of Chaparral Cars for next year in Formula 5000. Would you like to drive for us? So that's how it started. So 1973 was the first year. Well, I won 5 races, but the young South African who went on to become world champion for Ferrari, Jody Scheckter, he won 4, but I missed 2 races. I was driving for Ferrari in Europe, and so I didn't get the points, so he won. Then 74, USAC joined in, the roundy round guys, the Indy guys, who weren't really road racers. You know, they were experts in these roundy round tracks. But suddenly into the series came Mario Andretti, Bobby Unser, Al Unser, Gordon Johncock, Johnny Rutherford, and others. So the competition in the series suddenly went woof like this. But anyway, I managed to win in 74 with Mario second. And I won again in 75 with Mario second again. And then again in 76 when Alan Senior was second. So we had a fantastic run. It was a great, great team. Franz Weiss built the engines and he set the car up and he test drove it because Jim Hall had a test track in Midland, Texas. And so I had the cars were beautifully prepared. And, you know, at that time when the 302 cubic inch Chevrolet racing engine wasn't hugely reliable, but I had one engine failure in 5 years. And this was Franz Weiss who built it so reliable. And that was in practice somewhere. So fantastic. The trouble was at the end of 76, the SCCA, Sports Car Club of America, changed the rules because Can-Am, which had gone out in 1974, that was the last year for Can-Am, they'd had bigger spectator crowds than they were getting for Formula 5000. So the track owners, they all wanted to bring back the name Can-Am. So now we got a message from the SCCA saying, please put bodywork on your cars, all enveloping bodywork, and call it Can-Am. So I go to the first race of the new season at Saint-Jovite in Canada. I've never seen the car before, but I know that it's well prepared. You know, I've driven for them for 4 years at Chaparral. Out I go, it's good. And at that point, I was 3 seconds ahead of anybody else in the field. And Jim Hall, when I came into the pits after 20 minutes, he said, how is it? I said, it's good. What do you want? You know, what do you want to change the balance of the car in the corners, in the turns? And so I said, drop the front wing 1/4 inch. That's not much. And on the next lap out, at 160 miles an hour, it took off, went straight up in the air. Went about 40 feet in the air, turned over and came down. And it broke my neck, C1, smashed the shoulder, split my breastbone, broke my ribs. The roll bar broke. I went down on the road. So my helmet was like, and as the car went upside down up the track, it rolled off the track, and the track was a bit higher than the surrounding land. It landed on its wheels, which is a good job because the track doctor was a heart specialist and my heart had stopped, so he got it going. Then the ambulance blew a tire on the way to hospital. And when my wife arrived from England the next day, there's a photograph of the ambulance, the doors open, the two guys working on the wheel, and it said, Redman anymore, Redman is dead. So that took me a long time to recover from that, 9 months or so. But anyway, in December of that year, I was walking a little bit, living in England, walking and trying to run. And I rang Joe Hoppen, who was the head of Volkswagen, Porsche and Audi competition in America. And I said, can you find me a car for the Daytona? So the Sebring 12 hours in March, next March, which is like 4 months away. But I said, not a potential winning car, but just a decent car. So he got me a ride in the Dick Barber's second car. Dick Barber was a remarkable entrant of Porsches, and who you know, he hired the top line drivers to drive with him so that he has a chance of winning. And then he rented out the second car. And on this particular occasion, it was Charles Mendez, who was a businessman from Tampa, who was actually the promoter of the race of the Sebring 12 hours. And Bob Garrettson, who prepared the cars for Dick Barber. So this was the second, and we won the race. It was unbelievable. We had no trouble in the 12 hours. We just kept grinding around.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've been very lucky. I mean, my two great, all the drivers from the Porsche winning team in 1970 with the 917 and the 9083, they're all dead. I'm the only one left for the team.
Wow. And then you do a lot of historic racing now, correct?
Yeah, in about 1983, 82, 83, I started doing American historic racing. And I was driving for a gentleman who'd bought a car from me from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, George Hurd. And when he bought the car, he said, I don't drive. He said, will you race it? I said, he realized I'm a professional driver. He said, what does that mean? I said, it means you pay me $5,000 a race plus expenses. So I did that for more than 20 years.
Wow.
And then at the same time, we started organizing events with my son, James. We organized vintage events, and we actually were the organizers of the 3 big Porsche Rennsport events. The first one, it was 1998. We promoted an all Porsche race at Watkins Glen. And Porsche had sent 5 cars from the museum in Stuttgart that had been at Laguna Seca a couple of weeks before. They sent those over. We had a great meeting, and they said, will you do another meeting and call it Rennsport 1 at Lime Rock in 2001? So we did that, and then we did Daytona 2004 and Daytona 2007. And then Rennsport moved to Laguna Seca in California, where it's been ever since. So.
And you've also, you had your own racing team for a little while, correct?
Well, kind of. I mean, you know, as part of this scene in the sort of having come to really to live in America, what happened after I broke my neck, as described in 1977, the next couple of years I really wasn't doing much. I was doing some races for Dick Barber in the 935, but that was about it. And I said to Marion, my wife, I've got to either go to Lola Cars in Huntingdon in England, which isn't a very nice area, or work for Carl Haas selling Lolas in Highland Park. So I rang Carl and I said, Carl, I need a job. He says, you can come to Highland Park and sell Lola cars and Hewland gearboxes. I said, how much? He says, 30,000 a year. So I said, including a car? No car. So we make this huge change. We lived in a beautiful, beautiful old house in the north of England. And I raised a small farm, and I raised Hereford cattle and sheep. And I gave all that up. I'd also bought a Porsche 917K, which was the Steve McQueen film car, and I'd paid $19,000 for it. And after my accident, I had to sell everything. I had to sell the house. I had no income. I sold this beautiful 18th century house in 2 acres of walled garden. And I sold the Porsche to a friend of mine, Richard Atwood, who'd won Le Mans in a 917. And then I sold it for him probably 15 years later when we were living in America. And he said he really wanted to sell it. And he said, would you be the agent? I said, well, I don't really like car sales agents. I said, but I will on one condition. He said, what? I said, that I am the only agent. If Eskimo Nell sells it in Alaska, I still get my commission. And he said, yes. So a year later, I hadn't found anybody wanting to buy it. He said, I really need to sell it. And I said, the only way to get cash for it right now is to take it to auction. And I did that in Monterey, California, and sold it for $1.2 million. And it now belongs to Jerry Seinfeld and is valued at more than $20 million.
And then looking back over your career, would you have done anything differently? Is there any regrets that you made?
Yes, I would have done Indy. I didn't really realize how important it was in America. And in 1974, when the Indy guys joined in Formula 5000, so USAC, which was the organizing body for Indy and the other round races, had joined forces together in 74. And I was offered an Indy drive that year in 74, but I turned it down because I saw how all the Indy drivers were struggling with road racing, except for Mario, and to some degree, Bobby and Alan. So they were catching up fast, but most of them, they really struggled with it. I thought, I don't want to go to Indy and spend a year learning, how to drive that type of car. And then in 77, the week after I had my accident in Canada, I was due to go to Indy to test for a team. So it never happened. So that's probably the biggest single regret. But I can't complain.
Yeah. And would you have any advice to give to the younger generation trying to get into motorsport, just in general?
Yeah, I mean, to get in on the racing driving side today is so different to when I started in my street car. For a one-day race, you arrive at 7 o'clock in the morning at the racetrack, you use a shoe whitener to paint a number on the car doors and electrical tape to cover the headlights, with no safety belts, no fire extinguisher, no roll bar. We just use the road car, but you can't do that today. So you have to have a proper car, which is just incredibly expensive. And so, for somebody that doesn't have any income or the backing, the means to get that income, then the best way is probably to go and work for one of the racing schools, of which there are several in America, probably 10 or 11 at least, racing schools, and go and start at the bottom, do, sweeping floors and do all that sort of thing, and then become an instructor eventually, because a lot of school instructors have become very good professional drivers because they get some wealthy guy who comes in, he wants a school and he likes you and he says, well, why don't we run this car in a race? So quite a lot of people have done that. But on the technical side, there's a big demand, for skilled technicians today, whether it's in racing or, I was just, a Porsche dealership technician or BMW dealerships, and I'm sure there are others as well, but they earn, $100,000 a year and more because of the technical side is so complex today, analyzing. And of course, as we're going down the road of electrification, which is coming fast, if I was young today, I'd do studying in school for something. I mean, I would study concentrating on the electrical hybrid and electric motor side. Yeah, the good jobs, great jobs available, but you start off at the bottom, of course, you go work at a dealership, and then eventually you move up more. BMW in Spartanburg make 10,000 cars a week.
Wow.
They're actually America's largest exporter of cars. And they employ something like 11,000 people.
Wow.
So there are great opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's all the questions that I have. It was great talking to you. It's great learning about your history and your racing career. But yeah, I don't have anything else to add.
Well, 5 or 6 years ago, I produced a my book on my life, and it's available on gorace.com, www.gorace.com. And the book's done very well. It's actually a small sort of niche market book. It's had 4 printings and over 8,000 sold so far.
Yeah, that'd be a great read.
It's the same person calling me back.
Really want to talk to you. Well, I'll get off your hair. You can take the call if you'd like. But yeah, it was great talking to you. And best of luck in the historic. You're still doing historic racing, correct?
Yeah, I've just got my 61st racing license, but to be honest, these days I don't race. I drive in a race. It's a bit different. Yeah, if I try racing, something unpleasant will happen.
Yeah.
So very good. Well, yeah, call anytime with any questions.
Well, yeah, it's great talking to you, and yeah, have a great day.
Okay, thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye now.